For 15 years, a gray wool coat hung untouched in the back of my closet, pushed behind the winter boots and the vacuum cleaner I never used. I kept meaning to donate it. I never did. And then one Tuesday afternoon, while I was finally clearing out closet space, I reached into the inside pocket of that coat and found something that would change the rest of my life. But before I tell you what it was, and before I tell you about the man who tried to take it from me, welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. The closet was the last room I hadn't touched. That's how these things go, isn't it? You clean the kitchen first, then the bathroom, then the bedroom, and you save the closet for last because the closet is where the past lives, folded up and hung on wire hangers, waiting for you to finally deal with it. My name is Diane Whitfield. I was 52 years old, recently divorced, and working as a high school biology teacher in Denver, Colorado. I had rented a small 2-bedroom townhouse on the east side of the city, close enough to my school that I could walk if the weather cooperated, far enough from my old life that I didn't drive past our old house by accident anymore. It wasn't the townhouse of my dreams. The carpet was a strange shade of beige, and the kitchen faucet dripped no matter how many times the landlord promised to fix it, but it was quiet. It was mine. I had been married to Gregory Whitfield for 19 years. 19 years of shared mortgage payments, shared holidays, shared exhaustion that slowly, over time, stopped being shared and started being mine alone to carry. The divorce had finalized 14 months before that Tuesday afternoon in the closet. We had split the retirement accounts, the furniture, and a house full of memories that neither of us particularly wanted anymore. Gregory kept the lake cabin. I kept my car, my pension, and a version of peace I was still learning how to hold on to without flinching. I had a routine by then. Up at 5:45, coffee before I graded a single paper, a 20-minute drive to Lincoln High where the juniors called me Mrs. W. and mostly behaved themselves. My daughter, Emma, was 24 and living in Boulder, finishing her master's degree and calling me every Sunday night whether she had news or not. I had rebuilt something small and steady out of the wreckage of my marriage, and most days I told myself that was enough. The coat had belonged to a different version of me. I'd bought it during a work trip to Chicago 15 years earlier, back when Gregory and I were still young enough to argue about money without it meaning anything permanent. It was a good coat, soft gray wool, a little too formal for my life in Denver, and I'd worn it exactly twice before deciding it wasn't practical and hanging it in the back of the closet, where it had stayed through 2 house moves, a kitchen renovation, and the slow unraveling of my marriage. I almost didn't check the pockets. That's the part that still makes my hands go cold when I think about it. I had a garbage bag open on the bed for donations, and I was moving quickly, coat after coat, barely looking at what I was folding. But something about the weight of that particular coat's inside pocket caught my attention, a stiffness where there shouldn't have been one. I slid 2 fingers inside and pulled out a folded piece of paper, soft at the creases, the way paper gets when it's been carried around and forgotten. It was a lottery ticket, a Colorado lotto ticket, dated a little over 2 years earlier. I remembered buying it, vaguely, the way you remember a dream a few hours after waking. I had stopped at a gas station on Colfax Avenue on my way home from a parent-teacher conference, tired and irritated after a long day, and on a whim I'd bought a single ticket, $2. I tucked it into my coat pocket, put the coat on for the drive home because it had started raining, hung the coat up when I got inside, and then nothing. Life had continued. I had forgotten the ticket existed entirely. I almost dropped it into the garbage bag along with everything else. My hand actually hovered over the opening. It was 2 years old. The odds of it being worth anything felt laughable. But there was a small, stubborn part of me, the same part that made me double-check every quiz I graded, the same part that couldn't leave a loose thread alone, That made me set the ticket on my nightstand instead and finish the closet, and tell myself I'd look it up later out of nothing more than idle curiosity. Later came about 40 minutes after that. I sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop, a mug of tea going cold beside me, and I pulled up the Colorado Lottery website. I typed in the date on the ticket. I found the winning numbers for that drawing. And then I sat very still, comparing 6 numbers on a slip of paper to 6 numbers on a screen, certain I had made a mistake, certain that in a moment the numbers would rearrange themselves back into an ordinary Tuesday. They didn't rearrange. Every single number matched. I didn't scream. I didn't call anyone. I sat at my kitchen table in a townhouse with a dripping faucet and stared at the screen until it dimmed on its own. And then I picked up my phone with hands that were not entirely steady, and I dialed the number listed for Colorado Lottery claims. It rang twice before a woman answered, her voice bright and practiced, the voice of someone who fielded 100 routine calls a day and expected mine to be the 101st. I read her the numbers on the ticket. There was a pause on the other end of the line, not the kind of pause that means someone is writing something down, but the kind that means someone has stopped what they were doing entirely. "Ma'am," she said, and her voice had changed, gone careful and slow. "Can you hold for just a moment?" I held. A recorded message played about responsible gaming. I looked out my kitchen window at the parking lot below, at a woman loading groceries into her trunk, at a squirrel running along the top of the fence, at my own reflection faint in the glass, and I waited. When the woman came back on the line, she introduced herself as Marla from the claims department, and her tone had shifted into something formal, something rehearsed for exactly this kind of moment. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "if this ticket is authentic and undamaged, and I have every reason from what you've described to believe it is, you may be holding a prize of $62 million. I did not say anything for what felt like a very long time. Outside my window, the squirrel disappeared into a tree. The woman with the groceries closed her trunk and drove away. The ordinary world kept moving exactly as it had a minute before, completely indifferent to the fact that mine had just cracked open down the middle. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, listening to the townhouse settle around me, the pipes ticking, a neighbor's television murmuring through the wall, a car passing on the street below, and I thought about the number. $62 million. I said it in my head over and over, the way you repeat a foreign phrase you don't yet trust yourself to pronounce, trying to find the shape of it, trying to make it feel real instead of like something I'd misheard. It didn't feel real. It felt like a sentence from someone else's life that had accidentally been read aloud into mine. By 2 a.m, the shock had started to give way to something else. Not joy exactly, not yet, but a low, persistent unease that I couldn't name at first. I sat up in the dark and reached for my phone on the nightstand, and almost without deciding to, I opened the folder where I kept my divorce paperwork. I had saved every document from the proceedings in a folder on my phone that I had, with a kind of grim humor I didn't examine too closely at the time, labeled Closed Chapter. I scrolled until I found the date Gregory had filed the initial divorce petition. Then I opened my calendar app and found the date printed on the lottery ticket, still sitting on my nightstand where I'd left it. The ticket had been purchased on a rainy Tuesday in April. Gregory had filed for divorce that August, 4 months later, which meant that on the evening I stopped at that gas station on Colfax and bought a $2 ticket on a whim. Gregory and I had still, on paper, been a married couple. I set the phone down and sat in the dark for a long time, my heart doing something slow and heavy in my chest. Would he find out? How would he find out? I hadn't told a single living soul. I had spoken only to Marla at the lottery office, and Marla had given me a claim number, instructions on how to bring the ticket in with 2 forms of identification, and nothing else. She hadn't asked about my marital status. She had no reason to know or care. But Gregory had a talent, cultivated over 19 years of marriage, for noticing things. It wasn't intuition exactly, and it certainly wasn't warmth. It was something closer to vigilance, the habit of a man who had spent 2 decades keeping careful track of what belonged to him and what might slip away from him. He had noticed the week I started seeing a therapist before I ever mentioned it. He had noticed a raise in my paycheck before the direct deposit had even fully cleared. I had lived inside that particular kind of attention for so long that I had stopped recognizing it as unusual until I was finally free of it and could feel, in hindsight, exactly how exhausting it had been. Now, sitting alone in the dark with a lottery ticket worth $62 million folded on my nightstand, I felt that old, familiar watchfulness pressing on me again, even though Gregory was miles away and almost certainly asleep. Theoretically, he knew nothing. He couldn't know, but he had a way of finding things out, and if he did, I made myself stop. I made myself breathe slowly, deliberately, the way I used to coach nervous students before a big exam. I had spent 19 years of my marriage making decisions out of fear of Gregory's reaction, weighing every choice against how he might respond to it. I had promised myself, on the day the divorce was finalized, that I would never build my life around his moods again. I was not going to start now. I was going to think clearly instead. I got out of bed at 4:30 in the morning and made coffee in the kitchen, sitting at the same table where, 12 hours earlier, I had checked those numbers for the first time. I pulled a legal pad from the junk drawer, the one I use for grading notes and grocery lists, and at the top of a blank page I wrote what I know, what I need to do. The first thing I wrote was, "Tell no one yet." The second was, "Find a lawyer who specializes in this, not the one from the divorce." The third, "Do not go to the lottery office until I understand exactly where I stand legally." I stared at the list for a long moment, the sky outside my window slowly turning that particular pale gray that comes before a Colorado sunrise. I picked up the pen again and added a fourth line, "Document everything." The date, the purchase, the coat, all of it. It wasn't a plan yet, not really. It was the outline of one, rough and incomplete. But for the first time since I had dialed the lottery office the evening before, I didn't feel like a woman things were simply happening to. I felt like a woman beginning, carefully and deliberately, to take control of what happened next. I thought about calling my daughter, Emma, right then. I picked up my phone twice and put it back down twice. I loved her too much to hand her a secret this large before I understood what it might cost either of us to keep. I decided I would tell her when there was something solid to tell, not just a number, but a plan to protect it. I spent that Wednesday at school in a strange, floating daze, teaching photosynthesis to a room full of 16-year-olds while carrying a secret worth more than the entire school district's annual budget folded into the inside pocket of my purse, wrapped now in a sandwich bag because some instinct told me to protect it from coffee spills and rain and anything else that might damage it before it could be authenticated. That evening, I sat down with my laptop again, this time not to check numbers but to search for attorneys. I typed careful phrases into the search bar: lottery winnings, divorce, Colorado, asset protection, sudden wealth, equitable distribution, lottery ticket timing, and read through more legal terminology in one evening than I had in the entire 8 months of my divorce proceedings combined. One name kept surfacing across multiple legal directories: Margaret Holloway, a Denver attorney who specialized in complex asset disputes, with a track record that included at least a dozen cases involving lottery winnings and inheritance disputes tangled up in divorce timelines. Her website was plain, professional, entirely without the glossy self-promotion of some of the other firms I'd found. I liked that about it immediately. I didn't call from my own phone. I'm not entirely sure why. Some instinct. Some residual caution left over from 19 years of a marriage where privacy had never quite been guaranteed. I drove to a coffee shop 3 neighborhoods away the next morning before school and called Margaret Holloway's office from a payphone I found, almost by miracle, still bolted to the wall outside a laundromat. Her assistant scheduled me for that Friday afternoon. I hung up the payphone and stood there for a moment in the cold morning air, my breath fogging in front of me, the ticket still tucked safely inside my purse. $62 million. A number I could not yet fully believe belonged to me, and a man somewhere across the city who I was already, quietly and carefully, preparing to keep it from. Margaret Holloway's office occupied the 9th floor of a glass building downtown, with a view over the Denver skyline that made the whole city look smaller and more manageable than it actually was. She was a compact woman in her early 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of unhurried composure that made you feel, within 30 seconds of meeting her, that she had heard every version of every complicated story a person could bring into her office and had never once been rattled by one. I laid it all out for her in the order I had rehearsed in the car on the drive over: the coat, the ticket, the date, the gas station, the 4-month gap between my purchase and Gregory's divorce filing. She listened without interrupting once, her pen moving steadily across a legal pad, and when I finished, she set the pen down and looked at me directly. "The good news," she said, "is that you have a genuinely defensible position. You bought this ticket with cash, correct?" I nodded. $2, cash, from my own purse. "That matters more than you might think," she said. "There's no joint account transaction, no shared credit card, nothing that automatically ties the purchase to marital funds. That's a real advantage. The complication is the timing. Colorado is an equitable distribution state, which means property acquired during a marriage, including lottery winnings, can, under certain circumstances, be subject to division between spouses. If your ex-husband's attorney can successfully argue that the $2 you used came from marital income, or that the purchase fit into a broader pattern of shared household spending, they have grounds to make a claim. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. How strong of a claim? That depends entirely on the evidence, Margaret said, which is exactly why we're going to build a very thorough paper trail, starting now, before anyone on the other side even knows this ticket exists. She walked me through what she would need. Bank statements proving the cash I'd used came from my individual teaching salary, deposited into an account that had existed in my name alone since before the marriage. Receipts, if any still existed, from the gas station where I'd bought the ticket. Any loyalty program or rewards card that might place me there on that specific date. I thought hard, sitting in that office chair, mentally retracing a rainy Tuesday from over 2 years earlier. "I have a rewards account with that gas station chain," I said slowly. "I've had it for years. I use it for the discount on gas." Margaret allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, the first genuine expression I'd seen from her all afternoon. "Pull that transaction history the moment you get home. If your fuel purchase shows up on that account for that date, combined with a bank withdrawal record close to that same time, we can begin establishing a clean, individual chain of ownership. That's the foundation everything else gets built on." "There's something else," I said, remembering. "I stopped at an ATM that same afternoon, before the gas station. I remember because it only had 20s left and I needed cash for something small, so I withdrew $40 just to have change in my wallet." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Get that ATM record, too." "Karen, I mean Diane," she corrected herself with a small, apologetic smile. "I want to be honest with you about what's ahead. If your ex-husband finds out about this, and eventually he will, this is very likely going to become a fight. But if we can establish, clearly and early, that this was an individual purchase made with individual funds before any hint of contested ownership existed, we have a genuinely strong position going in." I retained her that afternoon, writing a check for the retainer with a hand that surprised me by staying steady. On the drive home, I stopped at my credit union and requested 6 months of statements for both my checking account and my ATM withdrawal history. I sat in the parking lot afterward and pulled up the gas station's loyalty app on my phone, scrolling back through 2 years of routine fuel purchases until I found it. A transaction dated that same rainy April Tuesday, 7:18 in the evening, $18.40 in fuel at the Colfax Avenue location. My hands were shaking slightly as I screenshotted it. The record placed me there. It was real, documented, provable, not just a memory I could be talked out of trusting. I was still sitting in the parking lot, quietly absorbing the relief of that discovery, when a text came through from Emma. I read it twice before the meaning fully landed. "Hey Mom, weird question. Dad just called me asking if you'd come into any money recently." His exact words were, "Has your mother mentioned anything unusual lately?" "Everything okay?" I sat very still, my thumb hovering over the screen. Gregory was already asking questions. Somehow, through some channel I couldn't yet identify, he had caught the scent of something. Had someone at the lottery office mentioned my claim to a friend of a friend? Had he simply noticed a change in the rhythm of my life? Some invisible shift only he would think to look for? Denver wasn't a small city, but it had a way of being smaller than you expected, its social circles overlapping in inconvenient ways. I typed back carefully, nothing major going on. "You know your dad, always fishing for something. I'll call you this weekend. I love you." Then I set the phone down and went inside my townhouse and, following Margaret's instructions from that afternoon, photographed every single piece of evidence I had gathered. The ATM receipt, the gas station loyalty record, the ticket itself, now sealed in a plastic sleeve, handled carefully at Margaret's suggestion, stored inside a small fireproof lockbox I'd bought that same evening at a hardware store on my way home. I uploaded copies of everything to a secure cloud folder Margaret's office had set up for me. I understood, sitting at my kitchen table that night with my phone open to Emma's message, that the real point of no return hadn't been finding the code, or checking the numbers, or even calling the lottery office. It was this moment, watching the little typing indicator appear and disappear under Emma's name, knowing that somewhere across the city, Gregory was already beginning to move, already asking questions, already circling something he could sense but not yet name. And so quietly, deliberately, I began moving too. Margaret filed the formal ownership claim with the Lottery Commission the following Thursday, alongside my prize claim, 3 weeks after our first meeting. I arrived at the Colorado Lottery headquarters with the original ticket, 2 forms of identification, and a folder of supporting documentation, so thorough that the intake officer actually paused halfway through reviewing it to glance up at me. "You came prepared," he said. "I try to," I told him, which wasn't entirely true yet, but was rapidly becoming true with every week that passed. The Lottery Commission confirmed the ticket's authenticity that same afternoon. $62 million, pre-tax. Margaret had already advised me, during one of our earlier meetings, to take the lump sum payout rather than the annuity, and once federal and state taxes were factored in, the number that would eventually land in my accounts came to just under $37 million. It was a figure so large that my mind kept sliding off it, the way your eyes slide off a word you've stared at too long until it stops looking like a real word at all. Margaret explained that once the claim was officially processed, it would become a matter of public record within roughly 2 weeks. That gave us a window, and we used every day of it. She began drafting an asset protection structure, a trust, dedicated accounts, documentation clearly establishing the ticket's origin as separate, individually owned property, built specifically to withstand exactly the kind of legal challenge she suspected was coming. We were 9 days into that window when Gregory called me directly. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 5 months, not since the last logistical phone call about splitting our old storage unit. His voice, when I answered, was exactly as I remembered it, pleasant on the surface, measured, carrying that particular flatness underneath that I had once mistaken for calm and had only understood, years later, as a form of control. "Diane," he said, "I think we need to talk." "About what, Gregory?" A pause. "I think you know." I was standing in my kitchen, one hand resting flat against the counter, and I watched a bird land on the fence outside my window and take off again almost immediately. "I don't know what you're referring to," I said, keeping my voice level. If you have something specific to say, say it. He exhaled audibly. Vanessa is going to be reaching out to your attorney's office. We're filing a motion. Vanessa Cole was the woman Gregory had been seeing for the better part of a year, a real estate and family law attorney he'd introduced to Emma at Thanksgiving, whom Emma had described afterward, carefully and diplomatically, as very sharp. I had filed that description away at the time without examining it too closely. Now I understood exactly why it mattered. That's between your attorney and mine, I said. Don't call me about this again. I hung up before he could respond. The formal motion arrived at Margaret's office 36 hours later. Gregory Whitfield versus Colorado Lottery Commission and Diane Whitfield, arguing that the winning ticket constituted marital property acquired during a legally valid marriage, and requesting an emergency injunction to freeze distribution of the prize until the matter could be reviewed by a court. Margaret and I met that evening, and she read through the filing with the quiet, focused attention of someone examining a diagnostic scan. "It's competently constructed," she said, which I was beginning to understand was her particular way of saying this is going to be difficult. Vanessa is building around the presumption of marital community property. The core argument is that absent an explicit prenuptial exclusion, any asset acquired during the marriage, including a windfall like this, falls under equitable distribution review. Can she win with that argument? In front of the wrong judge? Possibly, Margaret said. But we have the ATM record, the gas station loyalty data, and a documented paper trail showing the cash you used came from your individual teaching salary, deposited into an account that predates the marriage and was never merged with any joint account. Our position is solid. It's not unbeatable, but it's solid. The preliminary hearing was scheduled 3 weeks out. In the meantime, Gregory and Vanessa escalated. Vanessa called Emma directly. A call Emma described to me afterward in a voice trembling with fury, informing my daughter that her mother had potentially concealed a significant marital asset during the original divorce proceedings, and that this raised, in Vanessa's words, serious legal and ethical questions that affect the whole family. Emma was 24, sharp and fiercely protective. She texted me in all capital letters within minutes of hanging up with Vanessa. I met her for dinner 2 nights later at a small Vietnamese restaurant near her apartment in Boulder, and I told her everything: the code, the ticket, the timeline, the legal fight now unfolding around it. I watched her expression move through shock, then disbelief, then a slow-building anger that finally settled into something quieter and steadier by the end of the meal. "They called me to pressure you into folding," she said flatly, setting down her chopsticks. "Yes," I said. "That's exactly what that was. What do you need me to do?" "Nothing," I said. "Stay out of it completely. Let me and Margaret handle this." She studied me for a long moment across the table, something shifting in her expression. "You're going to win this, aren't you?" It wasn't really a question. The preliminary hearing lasted just under 40 minutes. The presiding judge, a measured, exacting woman named the Honorable Patricia Osei, reviewed both filings and denied Vanessa's request for an emergency injunction blocking distribution of the funds. It wasn't a full victory. The underlying case would still go to trial, but it meant the money would not be frozen indefinitely, and it meant I still had time and leverage on my side. After the hearing, I drove home and didn't leave my townhouse for 3 full days. I called in sick to school, which I had done perhaps twice in my entire teaching career. I wore the same cardigan for 2 days straight, ate soup out of the pot standing at the stove, and let myself simply exist without armor for a little while, because I had been braced for a fight for weeks, and my body finally, quietly, insisted on a pause. On the morning of the 4th day, I woke at 5:45 out of habit, made my coffee, and felt something settle into my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief exactly, and not confidence either, but something steadier than both. Readiness. I called Margaret that afternoon. "What happens next?" I asked. "Now," she said, "we prepare for trial. And we make sure that when we walk into that courtroom, there isn't a single gap in our evidence for them to find. The call about a settlement came, predictably, through Emma. Gregory had learned by then that direct confrontation wasn't moving me, and that the formal legal process was grinding forward on a timeline he couldn't control from outside a courtroom. So he tried a different approach entirely. Emma called on a Tuesday evening, and I could hear the careful neutrality in her voice immediately, the tone she used when she was relaying information without wanting to editorialize on top of it. "Dad wants to know if you'd be open to talking about a settlement," she said. "He says Vanessa thinks there's a number that could make this whole thing go away before trial." I was sitting in my reading chair by the window, a book open on my lap that I hadn't actually been reading for the last 20 minutes. "What kind of number?" I asked. He mentioned something like 35% of the pre-tax amount. Emma paused. "Mom, I know what 35% of 62 million is, Emma." He's framing it as a goodwill gesture. His words, not mine. I looked out the window at the parking lot below, at a neighbor walking her dog in slow, unhurried circles, at an entirely ordinary Tuesday evening that had no idea what was happening inside my head. "I want you to listen to me carefully," I said. "This offer isn't goodwill. It's a calculation. He and Vanessa know their case's weaknesses, and they're trying to extract something before a judge tells them they'll get nothing at all." Silence on the line for a moment. "So you're saying no?" "I'm saying that a woman who bought a $2 ticket with her own money on her own evening, before she had any idea her marriage was ending, doesn't owe anyone 35% of what that ticket turned out to be worth." "Yes, I'm saying no." Emma exhaled slowly. "Okay," she said, and then after a pause, "Good." After I hung up, I sat in that chair for a long time, aware that the number on the table had been real money, not an abstraction. Over $21 million, offered as the price of making the whole conflict disappear. I understood, sitting there, exactly why some people in my position would have taken it. The stress of litigation, the public exposure, the sheer exhausting cost of fighting. I understood the mathematics of simply giving in completely, but I also understood something else, something that had been quietly forming in me since the night I first found that ticket. If I handed Gregory Whitfield $21 million he had no legitimate claim to, I wouldn't just be handing him money. I'd be handing him a story, the story of a woman who, when finally pressed hard enough, folded. And I was finished being that woman. I had spent 19 years folding, one small concession at a time, until there was almost nothing left of the shape I'd started out as. I called my closest friend, Renata Cole, the next morning. We taught at the same school for 9 years, ever since we'd been seated next to each other at a district training seminar and bonded over a shared, barely contained horror at the presentation slides. She was blunt, warm, and constitutionally incapable of softening a hard truth for anyone's comfort, including mine. Exactly the person I needed that particular morning. I told her everything, sitting at her kitchen table with 2 mugs of coffee going cold between us. She listened without interrupting, the way she listened to everything, and when I finished, she said, "You've been carrying all of this completely alone for weeks." I didn't want to put it on anyone until I understood what it actually was. "Diane," she looked at me steadily, "you need to let people help you." "Let me help you. What do you need right now?" I thought about it honestly. I need someone who isn't a lawyer to tell me I'm not being unreasonable. "You're not," she said, immediately, without a beat of hesitation. "You bought a ticket. You won. It's yours." That same week, Margaret introduced me to a financial advisor named Curtis Ambrose, a quiet, methodical man who specialized in sudden wealth management and had, over the course of a long career, seen enough windfall clients to have developed an almost soothing bedside manner around the whole subject. He walked me through the trust structure Margaret's office had built, reviewed the tax implications in detail, and then, near the end of our meeting, asked me a question no one else had bothered to ask yet. What do you actually want your life to look like once this is settled? I had to stop and genuinely think about it. A house, I said finally, not a mansion. Something with a real kitchen and a backyard. Somewhere Emma can come stay whenever she wants. He wrote it down, which I appreciated more than I expected to. And I want to fund something for public school science programs. Title I schools especially, the ones that never have money for real lab equipment. He wrote that down too. And Emma's student loans, I added. I want those gone. Sitting in that office, I understood something had shifted. Somewhere out there, Gregory and Vanessa were watching, waiting, calculating their next move. But in that conference room, I was quietly, deliberately building the outline of a life I actually wanted. A life entirely separate from the one I was fighting to protect. That, I realized slowly, was its own kind of victory, and I hadn't even reached the courthouse yet. They came to my townhouse on a Saturday morning, which felt, in hindsight, entirely deliberate. Saturdays are softer than weekdays. People's guards are lower. I saw Gregory's car pull into the lot from my bedroom window at a little past 10 and felt a small, cold recognition settle into my stomach before I'd even fully registered who was driving it. He bought a new car after the divorce, something sleek and dark, a purchase Emma had mentioned required him to refinance the small condo he downsized into. Behind him, a silver sedan I didn't recognize pulled into the space beside his, Vanessa's car. They buzzed the intercom downstairs. I considered, briefly, not answering at all, and then considered what silence might look like written up later as evidence of evasiveness, and pressed the button to let them in. I left the front door open and went into the kitchen to pour myself a second cup of coffee, and by the time they knocked and stepped inside, I was leaning against the counter in a cardigan, reading glasses pushed up into my hair, looking, I hoped, like a woman mildly and reasonably inconvenienced on her day off. Gregory looked the way he always looked, neatly put together, his expression arranged into the open, pleasant mask he wore whenever he wanted something from someone. Vanessa Cole was harder to look past. She was around 40, dark-haired, with the kind of deliberate posture of someone who had long ago decided that presence itself was a professional asset. She wore a tailored charcoal coat and small gold earrings, and I watched her eyes move across my townhouse in one quick, evaluative sweep, the same way I imagined she'd assess a property before a closing. I saw exactly what she saw, modest, rented, unremarkable, and I watched her settle, almost imperceptibly, into an assumption of advantage. "Diane," Gregory said warmly, "thank you for letting us up." "I almost didn't," I said pleasantly. "Coffee." They sat on my couch. Vanessa set a slim leather portfolio on her knee with the practiced ease of someone who wanted me to notice it before she'd even opened it. "We thought a direct conversation might be more productive than going through attorneys," Gregory said, in a tone I could tell had been rehearsed in the car on the way over. "We're not here to fight, Diane. We're here because we genuinely like to find a resolution that works for everyone." I held my mug in both hands. "Everyone," I repeated. "This situation," Vanessa said smoothly, taking over, "has real potential to become very public, very drawn out, and very expensive for all parties involved. Legal costs at trial would be substantial. And once press attention starts, it tends not to be selective about whose privacy it invades." She opened the portfolio to reveal a document, 3 pages, already printed, tabbed for signatures. "We have a counteroffer we believe is genuinely fair. 30% of the net post-tax award. That comes to just under $11 million. In exchange, Gregory withdraws the motion entirely, all litigation ends, and the matter is sealed." I didn't look at the document. I looked at Vanessa instead. 11 million was a smaller absolute number than the 35% of the pre-tax figure Emma had relayed a week earlier, which told me, quietly and clearly, exactly how their confidence in the underlying case had shifted since the preliminary hearing had gone against them. They had moved from 35% of 62 million to 30% of the much smaller after-tax total. The math, once I actually worked it through, revealed a retreat dressed up as a negotiation. "Diane," Gregory said, his voice softening into a register I recognized from years of marriage, the one he used when he wanted to sound as though something personal, not strategic, was happening. "We were married 19 years. I'm not your enemy here. Whatever's happened between us, I don't want this to turn into a war." I set my mug down on the counter with a small, deliberate click. "Gregory," I said, "I want to make sure I understand this correctly. You're sitting on my couch, offering me a portion of money that is entirely and legally mine, in exchange for me not continuing to defend a legal claim you already know has no real merit. Is that an accurate summary?" Vanessa's expression tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges. "The claim has substantial merit," she said, and there was a new crispness in her voice now, professional and a little defensive. "Colorado courts have consistently—" "Margaret Holloway's reading of the relevant statutes differs from yours," I said. "And so does Judge Osei's, based on her denial of your injunction request 3 weeks ago." Silence settled over the room. Gregory glanced at Vanessa. Vanessa glanced at me. "If you refuse this offer," Vanessa said, her voice flattening into something harder, "we will absolutely pursue this to a full trial. That's a minimum of a year, possibly longer. Every detail of your finances, your history, your decisions, all of it becomes part of the public record." It was dressed as a warning, but it landed in my chest exactly like what it actually was, a threat. I felt a cold weight settle beneath my ribs. And then, almost immediately, something else beneath that, a steadiness that didn't come from an absence of fear, but from having decided, very clearly and very recently, that I was far more afraid of losing myself again than I was of losing this fight. "Then we'll see each other in court," I said. They left not long after. Gregory went first, and I noticed the small, rigid set of his shoulders, the particular way he carried anger he wasn't allowed to express out loud. Vanessa followed, and at the door she paused and looked back at me with an expression I couldn't fully place, something caught between contempt and a kind of reluctant respect. The door closed behind them. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment afterward, my hands trembling slightly now that I no longer had to keep them steady for an audience. I pressed my palms flat against the cold counter and breathed, slowly, deliberately, until the shaking eased. I understood exactly what I had just done. They would come at me now with everything they had. A full year of litigation, public exposure, every uncomfortable detail of my life laid open for scrutiny. I had said no to $11 million, and there was no walking that back. But standing there, I thought about every time in 19 years of marriage I had said yes instead, simply to avoid a fight. Every small concession that had, one at a time, made me smaller and smaller until there was barely enough of me left to notice the shrinking. I was not going to do that again. Not for $11 million, and not for anything else. I called Margaret that same evening. They came to the townhouse. I told her. 30% post-tax. I declined. There was a brief pause on the line. "Good," she said simply. "We go to trial." "Yes," I said, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "We go to trial." The weeks leading up to the trial date passed in a strange, suspended rhythm, school in the mornings, evidence review in the evenings, long phone calls with Margaret going over testimony, exhibit numbers, the precise order in which everything would need to be presented. Emma flew in from Boulder the weekend before the trial began, insisting on being there for support, even though I'd told her repeatedly it wasn't necessary. She sat across my kitchen table one evening, going through the timeline of documents with me one more time, and at the end of it she looked up and said, quietly, "You know this is going to work, right? Everything about this is airtight." "I know the evidence is solid," I told her. "I don't know what a courtroom is going to feel like from the inside. Nobody does until they're standing in one." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and for a moment neither of us said anything else. Outside, the Denver evening was settling into that particular deep blue it takes on before full dark, and somewhere across the city, I knew Gregory and Vanessa were doing their own version of the same preparation, building their own case toward the same courtroom, the same judge, the same reckoning. The courtroom, when the trial finally began, was smaller than I had expected. Not the grand wood-paneled chamber of a television drama, but a plain, fluorescent-lit space with worn carpet and the faint, particular smell of old paper that seems to live in every courthouse regardless of how modern the building around it is. Judge Patricia Osei entered at 9 sharp, and the whole room reorganized itself instinctively around her presence in the way rooms do around real authority. I sat at the petitioner's table beside Margaret, a legal pad in front of me with a single line written at the top in block letters, the date printed on that lottery ticket. I didn't need it written down. I knew that date better than my own birthday by then, but seeing it there in ink made everything feel solid in a way that weeks of mental preparation hadn't quite managed. Gregory and Vanessa sat at the respondent's table. Vanessa was representing him personally, a decision Margaret had privately told me was a tactical misstep. Attorneys who are emotionally entangled with their clients tend to lose the objective distance a case like this requires, and Vanessa, by every measure, had none of that distance left. Vanessa opened with a clean, confident argument. The ticket had been purchased during a legally valid marriage. Colorado's equitable distribution framework created a presumption of shared marital ownership absent a specific prenuptial exclusion. The court, she argued, should apply the standard framework and treat the winnings accordingly. She was genuinely good, precise, composed, clearly fluent in the relevant statutes. I watched Judge Osei taking notes in small, even handwriting, and felt the familiar cold weight return to my stomach. Then Margaret stood. "Your Honor," she said, "the respondent's argument rests entirely on a presumption, the presumption of marital community property. Our evidence today will demonstrate that this presumption is directly rebutted by clear, specific, and independently verifiable documentation establishing that this ticket was purchased using individual, non-marital funds at a specific, provable time and location." She walked the court through the evidence in careful order. First, my ATM withdrawal from my individual credit union account, an account established years before the marriage and never once merged into a joint account, timestamped that same April afternoon. Second, the gas station loyalty program record placing me at that specific Colfax Avenue location at 7:18 that evening. Third, a subpoenaed transaction log from the gas station's own point-of-sale system, which Margaret's team had obtained weeks earlier, showing a single lottery ticket purchase, cash, at 7:21 p.m., 3 minutes after my fuel purchase cleared. $2, cash, drawn from the exact withdrawal I had made earlier that same afternoon. The chain was complete and unbroken. Every link was documented, time-stamped, and independently verifiable. Not a single dollar of it had touched anything shared. Judge Osei examined each exhibit with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who could not be rushed by either side. I couldn't read her expression, but I had learned by then that reading a judge's face mattered far less than having facts solid enough to speak for themselves. Vanessa's cross-examination began confidently, but it started to unravel almost immediately. She challenged the ATM record first, arguing that cash withdrawn from an individually held account could still be classified as marital income earned during the marriage, and was therefore subject to distribution regardless of the account's ownership structure. Judge Osei asked her to clarify the specific statutes supporting that interpretation. Vanessa cited Section 14-10-113 of the Colorado Equitable Distribution Code, and then referenced a 2018 appellate case she said supported her position directly. Margaret was on her feet within seconds. The case Vanessa had just cited, she pointed out, had actually been decided in favor of the individual account holder, not the contesting spouse. Vanessa had, in front of a courtroom, cited a precedent that argued directly against her own client's position. The room went very quiet. "Counselor," Judge Osei said in the even, unhurried tone of someone who never needed to raise her voice to command a room, "are you familiar with the actual holding in that case?" A pause stretched one beat too long. "Your Honor, the relevant portion establishes," Vanessa began, then stopped, recalibrating. "The relevant holding establishes that cash from a premarital individual account, absent evidence of commingling, retains its individual character, which is precisely the situation before us today," Judge Osei said, not unkindly, simply as a matter of fact. "Do you have evidence of commingling in this case, Counselor?" Another pause, shorter but harder. Vanessa did not have an answer ready. I felt it in that moment. Not a dramatic break, but a subtle shift, the way light changes when a cloud moves across the sun. Vanessa recovered her composure within a few seconds, which was, professionally, genuinely impressive. But something had already slipped away from her that she wasn't going to be able to fully recover, the judge's confidence in the strength of her argument. And then Gregory made it worse. He hadn't been scheduled to testify. Margaret had specifically prepared me for the possibility that Vanessa might avoid calling him at all, since an unsteady witness can do more damage than none. But Gregory leaned toward Vanessa and said something under his breath, and she shook her head, and he said it again, louder this time, before she could stop him. "I want to say something," he said, addressing the judge directly, not Vanessa. Judge Osei looked at him over the top of her glasses. "Mr. Whitfield, you're represented by counsel. If you wish to testify, your attorney needs to." "She bought that ticket to spite me," Gregory said, his voice controlled for perhaps the first 4 words, and then noticeably not. "She knew the marriage was ending. She bought it with money that was ours, and now she's sitting there acting like—" "Mr. Whitfield," Judge Osei's voice carried genuine weight now, "you will not speak again unless your attorney has the floor. Is that understood?" The courtroom had gone completely still. Vanessa placed a hand on Gregory's arm, her own face perfectly composed even as I could see, from across the room, the rapid internal recalculation happening behind her eyes. I looked at Gregory. In 19 years of marriage, I had watched him lose his composure only a handful of times, and every single time, he had looked not powerful in that moment but diminished, reduced by his own anger into something smaller and more transparent than he wanted to be seen as. He looked small now, sitting at that table. I looked back down at my legal pad, at that single date written in block letters, and Margaret caught my eye across the table and gave me one small, almost invisible nod. We rested our case shortly before noon. Judge Osei issued her written ruling 11 days later. Margaret had explained to me that this was how it usually worked. Judges rarely announced dramatic verdicts from the bench the way courtroom dramas suggest. They review the full record carefully, they write, and eventually a document lands quietly in your attorney's inbox, and that document determines the rest of your life. Margaret called me at 8:20 on a Thursday morning. I was standing in my kitchen, coat halfway on, travel mug already in hand, about to leave for school. I had made a point, through the entire trial process, of continuing my ordinary life exactly as it had been before, teaching my classes, grading papers, showing up for my students, because the alternative was letting the waiting consume every part of me, and I had decided months earlier that I wasn't going to let that happen. "Diane," Margaret said, "the ruling is in. Judge Osei found entirely in your favor." I sat down, right there on the kitchen floor, my legs simply deciding for me before my mind had fully caught up. The towel was cold through my slacks. I pressed my back against the cabinet and listened as Margaret walked me through the 20-page ruling. The ticket had been legally established as separate, individual property, purchased with funds from a premarital individual account that showed no evidence whatsoever of commingling with marital assets. The respondent's argument had failed to meet its evidentiary burden at every stage. Judge Osei had specifically noted, in writing, that the appellate precedent cited by respondents' counsel actually contradicted her own client's position, and that the misapplication of that citation was, in the judge's words, notable. Margaret told me that word, in a formal judicial ruling, was about as close as a sitting judge typically comes to open embarrassment on the record. The motion to contest was dismissed with prejudice, meaning Gregory could not refile the same claim again. The Lottery Commission was formally cleared to complete distribution of the prize, and because the court found the challenge to have been pursued without genuine merit, and because the ruling specifically noted the unnecessary distress and delay caused to me as the petitioner, Gregory was ordered to cover the full legal costs for both sides, his own fees and mine combined. "Is it over?" I asked, still sitting on the floor. "It's over," Margaret said. "Congratulations, Diane. The money is entirely yours." I sat on that kitchen floor for a long time after we hung up. The relief was too large to process all at once. It took a while to find its shape. I looked at the baseboards, which needed repainting. I looked at the small crack in the grout near the dishwasher I'd meant to fix for months. I looked at a photo of Emma on my refrigerator from her graduation. And then, quietly, without any real drama to it, I cried, sitting there on the floor in my coat, my phone still warm against my chest. I was suddenly nearly $37 million richer than I had been the day before. But what I actually felt, sitting on that floor, wasn't the money itself. It was the specific, solid satisfaction of having stood my ground through every single moment when everything in my history had trained me to fold instead. I hadn't given in during Gregory's phone call. I hadn't given in during the Saturday morning visit with the leather portfolio and its neat signature tabs. I had stayed exactly where I was through all of it. I called Emma first. She picked up on the first ring. "Mom, we won," I told her. She made a sound I genuinely never heard her make before. Half laugh, half sob, something like a pressure valve finally releasing. Then, in the voice of a 24-year-old trying very hard to sound composed, she said, "Of course you did. Come to dinner Friday. I'm cooking. Are you going to cook with money now?" I laughed, and it came out of me easily, freely, in a way that surprised me. "No, Mom. I'm going to cook with butter and garlic like a normal person." I called Renata next, and she screamed loudly enough that I had to hold the phone away from my ear, apologized, and then immediately screamed again. The prize distribution moved through Margaret's office and Curtis's trust structure over the following weeks. Nearly $37 million after taxes, settling into accounts that carried my name and only my name, with the clean, quiet efficiency of something finally going exactly right. I paid Margaret first, then the remaining taxes. Then I transferred enough to clear the entirety of Emma's student loans without warning her in advance, and received a phone call at 11 that night from a daughter crying so hard she could barely get words out. I put the phone on speaker and let her talk for almost an hour. I drove out to that same gas station on Colfax Avenue not long after and filled my tank completely, not the usual careful $15 I'd always rationed out during the marriage. I went inside and bought myself a coffee from the same machine, under the same fluorescent lights, past the same rack of gas station snacks by the door, the same small, unremarkable convenience store where a little over 2 years earlier I had reached into my wallet on a whim and, without knowing it, changed the entire trajectory of my life. I stood in the parking lot afterward, coffee in hand, and watched the ordinary evening traffic move down Colfax, the whole world getting on with itself, having no idea. Then I got back in my car and drove home. I bought a house that following spring, a craftsman-style home in the Washington Park neighborhood, tree-lined street, for bedrooms, a kitchen with windows on 2 full walls, and no lingering smell of anyone else's old life. Emma came over the first weekend with her boyfriend and a bottle of wine, and we ate takeout sitting on the floor because none of the furniture had arrived yet, and I watched my daughter laugh in a house that was genuinely, entirely mine and understood, sitting there, that I wasn't rebuilding my old life at all. I was building something new from the ground up. I launched the Whitfield Science Fund that following autumn, funding new lab equipment and supplies for 19 Title I schools across the Denver metro area, and in 2 cases, covering a science teacher's position that budget cuts had eliminated entirely. I visited those classrooms myself when I could, and sitting in the back of those rooms watching kids run real experiments for the first time, I felt something close to complete contentment. I left Lincoln High that same spring, though I still substitute teach a few weeks a year, mostly because I genuinely miss it. Gregory's finances, by contrast, continued to unravel. Covering both legal teams' fees on top of his existing expenses forced him to sell the condo he downsized into after the divorce. Vanessa was formally sanctioned by the state bar the following year for the misrepresented citation, along with a separate ethics complaint related to her direct contact with Emma during active litigation, and their relationship, according to what little I still hear through mutual acquaintances, did not survive the fallout. About 18 months after the final ruling, I was standing in my new kitchen with the radio playing something I'd loved back in my 20s, stirring a pot of sauce on the stove, and I caught myself dancing, just my shoulders, just a little, completely without meaning to. And I thought, standing there in a kitchen that was entirely mine, in a life I had built stubbornly and deliberately out of the wreckage of an old one, there it is. There's the version of me I fought so hard to become. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit subscribe, because there are so many more like it waiting for you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one. This has been Kate, and I'll see you in the next story.